May 28, 1940, 4 p.m. The Cabinet Room, 10 Downing Street. Winston Churchill stood alone at the window, watching smoke rise from distant fires across London, knowing that in 30 minutes he would face the most important meeting of his life. Not with Hitler, not with generals, but with his own war cabinet, where Lord Halifax and others were preparing to force him to negotiate Britain's surrender. 300,000 British soldiers were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. France was collapsing, and the men in the room next door believed Churchill's refusal to seek peace terms was insanity. In half an hour, they would demand he contact Mussolini to arrange negotiations with Hitler. If Churchill agreed, Britain would become a Nazi vassal state within weeks. If he refused, his government would collapse, Halifax would become prime minister, and the surrender would happen anyway. Churchill had one chance to save Britain, not through military genius or diplomatic maneuvering, but through words. He had to convince men who thought him a reckless gambler that betting everything on continued resistance was Britain's only hope. As he stubbed out his cigar and turned toward the cabinet room, Churchill knew that the next 2 hours would determine whether Britain fought on to eventual victory or joined the long list of nations that had submitted to Hitler's tyranny. The fate of the free world rested on whether a 65-year-old man with a speech impediment could find the words to make defeat sound like destiny. The nightmare had begun 18 days earlier on May 10, 1940, when Churchill received 2 pieces of news simultaneously. Chamberlain was resigning and making him prime minister, and Hitler had launched his western offensive, sending German panzers crashing through Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg in a devastating blitzkrieg that shattered the Allied lines within hours. Churchill had spent the previous decade warning about Hitler while his own party ridiculed him as a warmonger and a drunk, calling him finished and yesterday's man. But now, in Britain's darkest moment, they had no choice but to turn to the man they had mocked and marginalized. Walking through Buckingham Palace to accept the King's commission, Churchill felt a strange exhilaration despite the catastrophe unfolding across the Channel, telling his bodyguard, "I feel as if I'm walking with destiny." But he had no illusions about the magnitude of the task ahead. He was inheriting a military disaster that was deteriorating by the hour. The speed of the German advance was unlike anything seen in military history. Within 3 days, German armor had crossed the Meuse River and was racing toward the English Channel, slicing through French defenses as if they were paper, and the vaunted French army, which everyone assumed would hold the Germans as it had in 1914 to 1918, was disintegrating in chaos and panic. Churchill flew to Paris on May 16 for an emergency meeting with the French leadership, and the scene that greeted him was apocalyptic. Officials burning papers in the gardens of the Quai d'Orsay, preparing to abandon the capital, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud on the verge of nervous collapse, and when Churchill asked the French Commander-in-Chief General Gamelin where the strategic reserve was positioned to counterattack the German breakthrough, Gamelin shrugged and replied, "Aucune. None." Churchill, stunned, asked the question again in different words, unable to believe that France had committed all its forces to the front line with no reserves, and Gamelin repeated, "There is no strategic reserve." And in that moment Churchill realized that France was finished, that the great military power that had fought Germany to a standstill for 4 years in the trenches was going to collapse in weeks, leaving Britain completely alone. Back in London, Churchill faced a war cabinet infected with defeatism and panic. He had been forced to include Neville Chamberlain as Lord President and Lord Halifax as Foreign Secretary, both men who had pursued appeasement and who regarded Churchill's belligerence as dangerous rhetoric, and now, with the military situation deteriorating daily, Halifax began arguing that Britain should explore what peace terms Hitler might offer through Mussolini's mediation. Halifax was no coward. He was an intelligent, experienced diplomat who believed he was being realistic, pointing out that Britain could not defeat Germany alone, that the empire would be lost if Britain were invaded and conquered, that negotiating from a position of some strength was better than waiting until the position became completely hopeless. In the war cabinet meetings, Halifax spoke with aristocratic confidence, laying out the logic of negotiation. "If we can get out of this mess with our independence guaranteed, we should be fools not to accept it. We can always resume the war later if Hitler violates the terms." Chamberlain, still influential despite his resignation, supported Halifax, and other ministers nodded in agreement, finding Halifax's cold logic persuasive. Churchill fought back with everything he had, arguing that any negotiation with Hitler was a trap, that once Britain entered negotiations it would be impossible to maintain public morale for continued resistance, that Hitler could not be trusted to honor any agreement, that the terms would inevitably include surrender of the Royal Navy, British bases, and control of foreign policy, reducing Britain to a puppet state. But he could see he was losing the argument. Halifax's logic was too compelling, the military situation too dire, and on May 26, as the British Expeditionary Force retreated toward Dunkirk with German forces closing in from all sides, Halifax pushed harder, threatening to resign unless Churchill agreed to at least explore what terms might be available. The war cabinet meeting grew heated, voices raised, Halifax's face flushed with anger, and Churchill realized that if Halifax resigned, he would take Chamberlain and others with him. The government would collapse, and Churchill would be blamed for throwing away Britain's last chance for peace. In that moment of crisis, Churchill made a decision that would determine the course of history. Instead of continuing the debate in the small war cabinet where Halifax's logic held sway, he called an emergency meeting of the full cabinet. 25 ministers, most of whom he had appointed just weeks earlier, many of whom barely knew him. At 4:30 p.m. on May 28, Churchill stood before them in the cabinet room and delivered an extraordinary speech without notes, speaking from his heart about what was at stake. He told them that he had considered whether Britain should negotiate, that he understood the arguments for seeking terms, but that he had concluded it would be impossible to maintain public morale once negotiations began, that Hitler would demand the British fleet and air bases and effective control of British policy, and that such terms would leave Britain a slave state that had traded temporary survival for permanent subjugation. His voice rising with emotion, Churchill declared that if Hitler invaded Britain, "We shall fight on the beaches, in the streets, from the hills, and if this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." And the effect on the ministers was electric. These hard-headed politicians and administrators found themselves rising from their seats, some with tears streaming down their faces, crowding around Churchill to shake his hand and pledge their support, telling him they would rather die than negotiate with Hitler. When Churchill returned to the war cabinet with this overwhelming endorsement, Halifax found his position untenable. He could not resign and bring down the government when the full cabinet had just given Churchill a ringing vote of confidence, and though he remained as Foreign Secretary, the critical moment had passed. Churchill's determination to fight on was now government policy, and Britain would not seek peace terms no matter how desperate the situation became. Churchill had won not through military success or diplomatic brilliance but through the sheer force of his rhetoric. His ability to transform a military disaster into a moral crusade, to make continued resistance seem not foolish but heroic, not hopeless but Britain's finest hour. Even as this political crisis resolved, an extraordinary drama was unfolding on the beaches of Dunkirk. The Royal Navy had begun an emergency evacuation on May 26, hoping to save perhaps 30,000 soldiers before the position became untenable, but the operation rapidly expanded as civilian vessels joined the effort. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, private motorboats, ferries, lifeboats, hundreds of small craft crossing the channel under fire to lift soldiers from the beaches. German artillery shelled the harbor, Luftwaffe bombers attacked the ships, destroyers were sunk, soldiers drowned, but still the boats kept coming, day after day, through calm seas that seemed providential, and over 9 days they evacuated 338,000 British and French troops, a number that exceeded even Churchill's most optimistic hopes. He addressed Parliament on June 4 with characteristic honesty, warning that wars are not won by evacuations, that Britain had suffered a colossal military defeat and lost all its heavy equipment, but then pivoting to defiance. "We shall go on to the end, we shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And these words, broadcast to a nation that had been bracing for news of total disaster, transformed the narrative from defeat to defiant resistance. But France's agony was not finished. Churchill made desperate trips to Paris and Tours, trying to stiffen French resolve, even proposing a complete political union between Britain and France in a last-ditch attempt to keep France fighting. But the French government was paralyzed, divided between those who wanted to continue resistance from North Africa and those who believed further fighting was pointless. On June 16, the aged Marshal Pétain became prime minister with a mandate to seek an armistice, and France surrendered on June 22, signing the armistice in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918, Hitler's theatrical revenge for that earlier humiliation. Britain now stood alone, the only nation still fighting Hitler, facing a German military machine that controlled Europe from Norway to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic to Poland, and possessing overwhelming advantages in troops, tanks, aircraft, and industrial capacity. Standing before Parliament on June 18, Churchill delivered perhaps his greatest speech, acknowledging the gravity of Britain's situation but framing it as an opportunity for historical greatness rather than a prelude to defeat. His voice rumbling with determination, he declared, "What General Vagon called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister, and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." The Battle of Britain began in July as the Luftwaffe sought to destroy the RAF as a prelude to invasion. German bombers attacked coastal convoys, then RAF airfields, then London itself in massive daylight raids that filled the sky with aircraft, and young RAF pilots, many still teenagers, scrambled 4 or 5 times a day to intercept the raiders, fighting battles at 300 miles per hour 6 miles above England, and the odds were terrible. The Luftwaffe had over 1,300 bombers and 1,200 fighters, while the RAF could muster barely 700 fighters, and the Germans could replace losses while every British plane and pilot was irreplaceable. Churchill visited fighter stations and coastal defenses constantly, his presence and his ever-present cigar becoming symbols of British determination, and he gave the pilots a gift when he told Parliament on August 20th, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," a phrase that would define them forever as the few, giving their sacrifice meaning and immortality. The battle raged through August and September, Britain's cities burning under German bombs, civilians killed by the thousands, invasion barges gathering in French ports, and for weeks the outcome hung in the balance, but gradually the arithmetic shifted. The RAF was shooting down German bombers faster than they could be replaced, German fighter losses were mounting, and the Luftwaffe's confidence was eroding. On September 15th, the RAF intercepted and savaged 2 massive German raids, shooting down 60 aircraft for the loss of 26, and 2 days later Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. The RAF had held, and though the Blitz would continue for months, though London and other cities would burn, the immediate threat of invasion had passed, and Britain had survived its darkest hour. Looking back, historians recognize those weeks of May and June 1940 as one of the great turning points of history, a moment when Britain could have followed the apparently rational path of negotiation and accommodation, and had different decisions been made, the entire course of the 20th century would have changed. If Halifax had prevailed, if Churchill had been overruled or forced to resign, if Britain had entered negotiations with Hitler at that moment of maximum weakness, there would have been no base for the eventual liberation of Europe, no rallying point for resistance movements, no example to inspire Americans that Nazi conquest could be resisted, and quite possibly no ultimate victory over Hitler's tyranny. But Churchill, through sheer force of character and the power of his words, convinced Britain to fight on when every rational calculation suggested surrender, and in doing so he did more than save his nation. He saved the possibility of a free world. His greatest achievement in those dark days was not military strategy or diplomatic maneuvering but something more fundamental. He gave Britain a story about itself that made sacrifice bearable and defeat unthinkable, transforming a desperate military situation into a moral crusade, and proving that sometimes the most important battles are won not with guns and tanks but with courage and words and an unshakable belief that some things are worth any sacrifice. In his finest hour, Churchill gave Britain its finest hour, and the free world has been in his debt ever since.